HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books presents 5 Miles Away, A World Apart. One City, Two Schools, and the Story of Educational Opportunity in Modern America. By James E. Ryan. Read by Adam Lofbomm. Introduction. Freeman and T.J. Equal educational opportunity is a foundational principle of our society, embraced as an ideal by school officials, citizens, parents, and politicians alike. Not all would agree on what makes educational opportunities equal, but most would agree, at least at a sufficient level of abstraction, that it remains a worthy, indeed a primary goal. Most would also agree that the goal remains elusive. Educational opportunities are far from equal in this country, and too often depend on where students live, on how much their parents earn, or on the color of their skin. This book tries to explain why. More precisely, this book tells the story of how law and politics have structured educational opportunity in this country for the last half-century. The story is a national one, but it has played out across 50 states and within thousands of school districts and schools throughout the country. To make the story more concrete, and to give it some life, throughout the book, I use as illustrative examples the experience of two schools, Freeman and T.J. high schools, their respective school districts, Henrico County and Richmond, and the state, Virginia, in which the districts are located. I cannot claim that the experiences in these places capture perfectly what has happened elsewhere. There are too many schools, districts, and states for any one set to be completely representative. But there are enough similarities across states and localities to make these examples useful, and, with appropriate caution, generalizable. Freeman High School sits near an intersection on a busy road in Henrico County, a suburb of Richmond, Virginia. The school opened in 1954, the same year that the Supreme Court decided Brown versus Board of Education. The school's mascot was, and remains, the Rebel. When it opened, the school population was 100% white. Today, the school is still predominantly white, but increasingly diverse. 73% of the students are white. 13% are African American. 7% are Hispanic, and 6% are Asian. The majority of students, roughly 75%, come from middle-class families, although socioeconomic diversity, like racial and ethnic diversity, has increased in recent years. When I first visited Freeman, the students had just finished a round of state tests for the day. They could expect to do well, as they had in the past. Freeman students typically perform better than the state average, consistent with Freeman's reputation as one of the more academically rigorous high schools in the state. Most students graduate in 4 years and go to college. The principal, on the day I met him, described the school as successful and challenging, but also as one that prides itself on fostering a sense of community. Although it is fairly large, at just over 1,600 students, I was told the school is a place where teachers know the names of students, and students know that they can trust the teachers. Thomas Jefferson High School, or TJ as it is known to students and teachers alike, is in the Richmond City School District and sits about 5 miles away from Freeman. Described by one author as the school that refused to die, TJ has a history that stretches back to the 1930s. It was once segregated and home to the affluent white residents of Richmond's West End. Since the 1970s, its student body has been predominantly African American. Indeed, the composition is nearly the mirror opposite of Freeman's. 82% of the students are black, 16% are white, and 2% are Asian or Hispanic. Most are from poor families. The students at TJ were also being tested on the first day I visited. Their prospects for success were not quite as bright. But this is not a failing school, at least not according to these tests, which form the primary basis for judging schools under both state and federal accountability schemes. Roughly 90% of TJ's students score at the proficient level on the state reading and math tests. These results seem impressive at first glance, but the tests themselves are quite basic, a point driven home by the fact that a 90% passage rate is still below the statewide average for high schools. Other measures of academic achievement, moreover, reveal troubling signs. Fewer than half of the eligible TJ students take the SAT, for example, compared to 2/3 of the students at Freeman, Only about 15% of TJ students take AP tests, and very few of these do well on them. By contrast, more than a quarter of Freeman students take AP exams, and more than 3/4 of them receive passing scores. Dropout rates are higher at TJ than at Freeman, and college attendance rates are lower. TJ is a smaller school than Freeman, enrolling roughly 840 students. The administrators and teachers I met were, for the most part, caring and hardworking, but the overall atmosphere seems tense and apprehensive. A metal detector marks the entrance to the school, and police officers monitor the halls and the cafeteria. During one visit to the school, I watched an officer break up a fight in the cafeteria and drag a student away. Teachers and administrators are justly proud of the students' improved performance on state tests, but they seem less secure about their students' academic achievement and the school's reputation. If you hit the lights at the right time, the trip from Freeman to TJ takes about 10 minutes by car. The route leads along Monument Avenue, a wide and famous boulevard that memorializes Confederate heroes Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, among others. In 1996, city officials added a memorial in honor of Richmond native Arthur Ashe, the path-breaking African-American tennis player. Along the way, you cross the border that separates the mostly suburban Henrico School District from the Richmond City School District. In doing so, you leave a world that, while becoming more diverse, is still largely white and middle class, and you enter a world that is mostly black and poor. In suburban Henrico, adults generally expect academic success, and children seem to understand and appreciate their opportunities and potential. In urban Richmond, academic success is hard-won and measured primarily by scores on state tests, and far fewer students seem as certain of their own opportunities or potential for success. The line that separates TJ and Freeman represents the most important boundary in public education, the boundary between city and suburban schools. This boundary has been the fault line of public education for half a century, doing more than anything else to define and shape the educational opportunities of public school students. On one side stand predominantly white, middle-income, and relatively successful schools. On the other side stand predominantly minority, poor, and relatively unsuccessful schools. The urban-suburban divide is not as stark today as it once was. The blurring of this line, as described in the final chapter, offers unprecedented opportunities to reshape educational opportunities for urban students. For now, however, the line remains significant in Richmond and elsewhere. I chose Freeman and TJ because they are good examples of the past and interesting harbingers of the future of educational opportunity. Both schools have been shaped by school desegregation in ways typical of many urban and suburban schools and districts. At one time, both schools fit the classic pattern of suburban and urban schools, with Freeman nearly completely white and middle class, and TJ nearly completely black and poor. But both schools are slowly becoming more racially and socioeconomically diverse. The increased diversity at Freeman is consistent with demographic trends in other metropolitan areas, where some suburbs are experiencing a marked increase in minority residents. In addition to these demographic changes, there is a nascent movement in the Richmond metropolitan area, led by business and religious leaders, to consider ways to integrate suburban and urban schools along socioeconomic lines. I also chose these schools because of the experience of Dr. Edward H. Pruden, who became principal of Freeman in 2000, and served in that role throughout most of the period during which this book was written. Most important, before coming to Freeman in 2000, Dr. Pruden served for 4 years as the principal of TJ. With over 20 years of experience as a teacher and administrator in both school systems, Dr. Pruden is uniquely qualified to assess the differences between these two schools, and between suburban and urban schools more generally. Freeman and TJ are also fairly representative of the large group of urban and suburban schools that tend to be hidden in plain sight. Neither school is at the extreme end of the spectrum in terms of student composition, funding, performance, or facilities. Freeman is not a lily-white, gold-plated suburban school. Indeed, it spends less per pupil than TJ. In turn, TJ is predominantly black and poor, but not exclusively so. The facilities are old but not decrepit. The city of Richmond, moreover, is a middle-sized city, not a mammoth like New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles. Henrico County is prosperous, but not extremely wealthy like Scarsdale, New York, or Greenwich, Connecticut. Freeman and TJ, in short, are not the type of schools depicted in Jonathan Kozol's well-known book, Savage Inequalities, which paints a shocking portrait of urban-suburban disparities that are certainly real in some places, but hardly the norm. To be sure, disparities exist between these schools, just as they do among most suburban and urban schools. The students who attend Freeman and TJ have unequal opportunities and face different futures. The divide that separates them is large and important, but the differences are more subtle than those that jump off the pages of Kozol's book, or other accounts that contrast high-flying suburban schools with completely dysfunctional urban ones. The future is also less bleak for TJ, and more uncertain for Freeman than one might believe from reading accounts that depict urban schools as vermin-infested centers of misery and suburban schools as Shangri-Las. The main plotline of this story follows the construction and maintenance of the boundary that separates urban schools like TJ from suburban schools like Freeman. The full story stretches back to at least 1954. But for immediate purposes, we can begin in 1972. That was the year in which President Richard Nixon offered a solution to urban-suburban segregation that has proven remarkably durable, if not especially effective. Nixon's Compromise. It might seem odd to identify President Nixon as the accidental architect of modern education law and policy, but the label fits. In March 1972, he took the unusual step of delivering a televised address devoted exclusively to school desegregation. In this speech, Nixon offered a basic roadmap for education policy that we are still following today. A few months before Nixon delivered his address, federal district courts in Detroit and Richmond had ordered suburban districts to participate in metropolitan-wide desegregation plans. The Richmond court decision would have merged the city district with those of neighboring Henrico and Chesterfield counties. In particular, it would have meant that some students attending Freeman would attend TJ, and vice versa. The courts in Richmond and Detroit favored a metropolitan-wide solution because urban school districts were already dominated by poor and minority students, as they are today. Without including the suburbs, which were mostly white and middle class, meaningful integration would not be possible. The lower court decisions were eventually overturned on appeal. But at the time of Nixon's speech, the possibility of cross-district busing or consolidation seemed very real. Nixon denounced this possibility and proposed legislation that would prohibit busing to achieve racial balance. He suggested that such legislation reflected the preferences of both black and white parents to keep their children in neighborhood schools. He then offered an alternative approach to the problems in urban schools. It is time for us to make a national commitment to see that the schools in central cities are upgraded, so that the children who go there will have just as good a chance to get a quality education as do the children who go to school in the suburbs. Nixon's compromise was clear. Poor and minority students would remain in the city and would not have access to suburban schools. But efforts would be made to improve education in city schools. In other words, save the cities, but spare the suburbs. To say that this compromise is all one needs to know in order to understand the basic structure of educational opportunity would oversimplify a complex area of law and policy. But only a little. Nixon's compromise, broadly conceived to mean that urban schools should be helped in ways that do not threaten the physical, financial, or political independence of suburban schools, continues to shape nearly every modern education reform. This compromise is evident in every major attempt, whether through court decision or legislation, to enhance or equalize educational opportunities, including desegregation decisions, school finance reform, school choice plans, and the current emphasis on standards and testing, embodied most visibly in the federal No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB. Indeed, to a large extent, providing some type of aid to urban students while maintaining the sanctity of suburban schools is the defining feature of modern education law and policy in the United States. The bulk of this story documents this feature and assesses its consequences. Desegregation and the suburbs. Start with desegregation. Less than 2 years after Nixon's 1972 address, the U.S. Supreme Court, in Milliken v. Bradley, halted efforts to integrate public schools across district lines. The court was closely divided. The division was 5-4, with all 4 of Nixon's appointees in the majority, but the outcome aligned with dominant political sentiment on both the left and the right. Liberal and conservative politicians alike had been working before the decision to limit cross-district busing. The decision essentially confined desegregation to urban school districts and relieved most suburban districts of any obligation to participate in integrating city schools. This was certainly true in Richmond. After the brief threat of district consolidation disappeared, desegregation in Richmond took place solely within district boundaries, while students in Henrico County remained free to attend schools in their own district, combined with intense residential segregation on the basis of race and class. Milliken also helped preserve a set of schools in urban areas nationwide that were and continue to be attended primarily by poor children. In Richmond, for example, 9 in 10 public school students are black, and 7 in 10 are eligible for free and reduced-price lunch, the most commonly used measure of poverty in the school context. Most schools in Richmond, not surprisingly, are predominantly poor. High-poverty schools, if not destined to perform poorly, are exceedingly unlikely to excel, especially if their performance is measured against that of middle-class suburban schools. Having endorsed the first half of Nixon's compromise in Milliken, a few years later the court tried to make good on the second half, in the same case out of Detroit. In Milliken v. Bradley, widely referred to in legal circles as Milliken II, the court ordered the state to provide compensatory aid to formerly segregated school districts. Echoes of Plessy v. Ferguson and its embrace of separate but equal were audible to some, but obviously unintended by the court. Compensatory aid was supposed to remedy the educational harms of segregation, not provide justification for a new era of legally segregated schools. Whatever the symbolic import of the decision, the practical effect of the Milliken decisions was clear. Together, they transformed many desegregation cases from fights over student assignments to fights over money. Urban districts with few white students and no access to the suburbs had little hope of integrating their schools, and went after Milliken II funding instead. Notice the ultimate impact. School desegregation was tamed and confined to urban areas, where it became largely about providing compensatory funding to urban schools. School finance reform. School finance litigation, which began in the late 1960s, went after money by design rather than necessity. Indeed, the premise of school finance litigation is that students do not need to be moved from one school or district to another to receive a decent education. They simply need access to well-financed schools. The early goal of school finance reformers was to guarantee equal funding for all schools, or at least equal access to funding. If this approach had succeeded, it might have tied schools together financially. Students from different racial and economic backgrounds would have attended different schools, but legislatures, parents, and citizens from cities and suburbs alike would have had reason to care about the financial fate of all schools, because all would be drawing from a common pool of money. Things did not work out as planned. School finance reform never got off the ground in the U.S. Supreme Court. In San Antonio v. Rodriguez, decided in 1973, the court upheld Texas's funding scheme against an equal protection challenge. The court also divided 4-5 in this case, with the same justices in the majority and dissent as in Milliken. The court recognized that the funding scheme led to inequalities, but refused to intervene because doing so would interfere with local control over education. The court had used the same justification in Milliken when it refused to extend desegregation across school district lines. In the desegregation context, local control protected the ability of suburban schools to reserve their seats for local students. In the school finance context, local control protected the ability of wealthy suburban districts to spend greater resources on their own schools. School finance litigation has since moved to state courts. Advocates in nearly every state have filed claims based on state constitutional provisions that guarantee a right to education. They have succeeded in roughly 20 states, though not in Virginia. Even successful suits, however, have not equalized resources. Most legislatures have responded to court orders by providing a bit more money for poorer districts, while leaving wealthier districts largely free to devote locally raised funds to their own schools. Indeed, most advocates no longer even seek to equalize resources. The favored strategy these days is to seek adequate funding, which is the amount thought necessary to ensure that all students receive a decent education. In embracing this strategy, advocates have abandoned the idea of tying the financial fate of districts together, as the goal of adequacy presupposes that wealthier districts will be able to devote more than adequate resources to their own schools. The end result is that suburban districts are largely left untouched by school finance reform, just as they were left untouched by school desegregation. This is not to say that all suburban districts spend more per pupil than urban ones. Indeed, Richmond spends a good deal more per student than Henrico County. But the truth is that no one really knows how much it costs to provide a good education to poor students in high-poverty schools, which places urban schools like TJ in a difficult bind. They may receive more money than their suburban counterparts, but it still might not be enough. The state legislature in Virginia, however, is not especially sympathetic to pleas by urban school systems for more money. State legislatures in Virginia and most other states tend to be dominated by suburban representatives, for the simple reason that most people live in the suburbs. The prevailing incentive among suburban legislators, whose constituents have no immediate stake in urban schools, is to not increase spending on city schools, but to limit it. This political dynamic has naturally attracted legislators to alternative reforms that do not revolve around money. The most important to have emerged over the last 2 decades are school choice and standards and testing. School choice. Like school desegregation and school finance reform, school choice has offered some relief to urban students, while preserving the sanctity of suburban schools. Although typically associated with conservatives, the idea of school choice is potentially quite radical, insofar as the logic of choice is in tension with the idea of neighborhood schools, which cater exclusively to local residents. After all, if students should be given a choice of schools, either because it is fair to do so or because choice creates competition, there is no logical reason why choice should be limited either to public schools within a single district or confined to private schools and voucher programs. Indeed, the fairness and efficiency rationales that supposedly justify school choice point toward opening all schools to those who live within a reasonable distance, regardless of district lines or existing neighborhood attendance zones. But this is not how choice plans have evolved. To the contrary, the often implicit principle that suburban independence must be respected has curtailed school choice. Most public school choice plans offer students choices solely among schools within their home district. Richmond, for example, has an open enrollment policy, which allows students some choice among public schools within city limits. Such plans are typical of those in other states. Limiting choice to schools within a particular district is also a feature of the school choice provision contained in the NCLB. This law gives students the right to transfer out of persistently failing schools, which are defined as schools that do not meet certain benchmarks on state tests. But choices are limited to successful public schools located in the same district. In many urban districts, this effectively means no choice at all, because there are too few successful schools within the district, and suburban schools are off limits. Other school choice programs are similarly constrained. Most states have inter-district school choice plans on paper, but these plans either make district participation voluntary or require schools to accept out-of-district students only when space is available. In addition, only a few states provide transportation across district lines, and very few require school officials to inform parents about the plan. Because of these limitations, very few students, less than 1% of all public school students, cross district lines to attend public school. Charter schools and voucher programs, the two newest and most widely discussed forms of school choice, also tend to be confined geographically. Charter schools, which are public but given more autonomy than traditional public schools, are usually located in urban districts and enroll local students. The location and enrollment patterns are the product of both law and popular demand. Many state laws explicitly direct or gently nudge charters toward urban areas, where they tend to be more popular in any event. In many suburban districts, charters are viewed by residents as either unnecessary or threatening alternatives to traditional public schools. There are relatively few publicly funded voucher programs, but these too are confined mostly to urban areas and do not allow city students to choose suburban schools. In Milwaukee and Washington, D.C., for example, vouchers may only be used at private schools that are located within city limits. In Cleveland, vouchers can be used at private city schools and at suburban schools, provided that the suburban school agrees to accept the voucher student. Not a single suburban school has volunteered. Teachers' unions are often identified as the reason why broad voucher programs have not been adopted. A closer look at political campaigns for universal voucher programs, however, reveals that they have failed primarily because suburbanites have not supported them. This is not surprising, given that many suburbanites already chose schools for their children when they purchased their homes, and most are satisfied with the schools they selected. From a typical suburbanite's perspective, broach voucher programs are unnecessary at best and potentially threatening at worst, as voucher programs could open up suburban schools to city students. President George W. Bush, who favored vouchers, apparently recognized as much while the NCLB legislation was being considered. Unaware that his comments were being broadcast to the press, Bush acknowledged before a White House event that there are a lot of Republicans who don't like vouchers. They come from wealthy suburban districts, and their schools are good. Despite their radical potential, voucher programs have been tamed and constrained. Like other choice programs, vouchers have been made to cohere with the basic theme of modern education reform. Some aid, this time in the form of school choice, is provided primarily to urban students. But the aid does not threaten the autonomy of suburban schools. Standards, testing, and the NCLB. At first blush, the standards and testing movement does not seem to fit so well with earlier reforms. The movement was created in part to raise expectations in low-performing schools, and in this sense was another example of an effort to help city schools. Instead of being structured in a way that leaves suburban schools alone, however, the standards and testing movement has affected all public schools. Because of federal and state laws, all students in each state are subjected to the same academic standards and judged by the same tests. One might think that standards and testing have done what no other reform has managed to do: tie the fate of all students together by subjecting them to the same standards and requiring them to pass the same tests. The rhetoric of leaving no child behind conveys the same impression. A closer look reveals something else entirely. The key point to recognize is that the academic bar has been set quite low, which is partially a product of the perverse incentives created by the NCLB, and partially a product of the same political dynamic that has shaped school finance reform and school choice. The NCLB requires states to impose sanctions on schools that do not meet certain testing benchmarks, but it lets states decide for themselves how hard their tests will be to pass. State officials are not dumb. They quickly realized that setting a high bar would lead to more schools being sanctioned, which would be costly, both financially and politically. Challenging standards would reveal the large gap between suburban and urban schools, creating pressure to close it. Challenging standards might also call into question the quality of some suburban schools, which would anger suburbanites. Neither possibility was attractive, so most states set the bar quite low. As a result, the standards and testing movement, in practice, is primarily about ensuring that students learn the basics. It is not about closing the gap between urban and suburban schools in educational opportunities or results. Students in many high-poverty schools, especially in urban areas, still struggle to pass the tests. This struggle and the penalty for failure tend to concentrate attention in these schools on little more than the tests themselves. Middle-class schools in suburban areas, by contrast, have relatively little trouble with the tests and provide an education that goes well beyond test preparation. Getting city kids to master the basics, to be sure, represents an improvement from the past in some schools. but the standards and testing movement, if
Sample complete. Ready to continue?